Do you often find yourself wondering about countries' CO2 emissions? No? Well, you're part of the problem. Climate change is a global issue, but not every country is equally at fault. Contrary to popular belief, a country's size does not necessarily dictate how much carbon it produces. Today we will explore the real factors that influence climate change in certain countries and why. Well, to begin with, who influences climate change the most? Well, 65% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which cause climate change, are the result of CO2. CO2 is commonly produced by the burning of fossil fuels, which are of course critical to our modern day life. Specifically, the United States and China account for 45% of the world's global carbon dioxide output. The European Union accounts for 9%, India for 7%, Russia for 5%, and Japan for 4%. The other 162 countries produce the other 30% of global carbon dioxide emissions. So it can only be asked, why do 33 countries produce 60% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions? To answer this question, let's break it down into multiple points. To begin with, the biggest polluter by far is China. China produces roughly 30% of the world's carbon dioxide. Some people might wonder how this is even possible. But when considering that 20% of the world's population lives in China, and that some 40% of China's GDP is in manufacturing, it is very possible. China produces most of the world's phones, computers, shoes, and much more. China is an industrial behemoth that works as the factory for the world, and this comes at the cost of high CO2 production. However, some people argue that geographically categorizing emissions is unfair, as nations will often outsource their emissions to developing countries, with larger industries and much cheaper means of production. That is why countries like China have disproportionately high CO2 levels, as they are shouldering the manufacturing load for many other regions. The point is accentuated by the fact that most of these countries that handle outsourced production are poor and use old, environmentally inefficient factories to produce the goods. When countries' exports are excluded from their carbon footprint, a different picture is painted than that of the generally accepted CO2 emissions culprit standings. As of 2008, the national rankings of each country's average citizen's carbon footprint went as follows. Of course, largest first. Belgium, the United States, Ireland, Finland, Australia, the United Kingdom, China, Brazil, India, and Nigeria. As you can see, despite all the industry, China still ranks low per person wide. This leads into the next point. If China produces so much CO2 because of its massive production capacity, then how do America and the EU make the list? These being mainly service sector economies. Well, as it turns out, along with having high populations, EU and American citizens live high carbon producing lives. US citizens continue to use fossil fuels in the vast majority of the hundreds of millions of cars in the United States. Additionally, the US continues to burn fossil fuels for a massive percentage of its power output. In the US, only 18% of the country runs on renewable energy power. Additionally, with the wealth of the US, lots of power is used for things ranging from computers to giant neon signs to fridges. In the end, it is the wealth of the average US person that really creates the CO2 production levels that are similar to China's. With the GDP per capita being just over 8,000 USD in China and over 57 USD in the United States, it is a miracle that the United States is not perhaps higher than China in carbon emissions. EU carbon emissions compare very similarly to the United States, with high usage of fossil fuels needed to power modern-day life. However, the EU has begun very significant carbon reduction programs and is increasingly getting better in the modern world at reducing carbon emissions that they create. India, Russia, and Japan all suffer from similar problems that put them on the top of the list, ranging from high population to relatively high GDP to high manufacturing capacity. And this brings us on to another question. What about the other 30% of CO2 emissions? What about these countries? What differentiates the lower 162 countries with the countries above? Well, to begin, the remaining countries are located mostly in South America and Africa, and they are too poor and not populous enough to make too much of a deal when it comes to CO2 emissions. If they cannot afford to buy a car, Then they will not burn the oil associated with owning a car. These countries mostly contribute not in burning the emissions themselves, but by extracting their vast reserves of oil and exporting them. Additionally, they clear-cut forests, which helps the earth absorb less and less carbon dioxide as the time wears on. And lastly, while these countries contribute very little to CO2 production, in the grand scheme of things, they still do produce around 30% of global CO2 emissions. 18% of this is thought to be from black carbon, the soot gathered from small cooking stoves and used by many millions to cook daily meals. As a final note, even within Africa, which is generally regarded as poor, only 6 relatively wealthy states provide for 84% of Africa's CO2 emissions. And this just shows how deeply there is a correlation between wealth and carbon dioxide emissions. Finally, you must be thinking, I know which countries produce the most CO2 emissions, and I know why they do so. But how can countries improve and make less carbon dioxide? Well, fret not. Here are some positive examples. The United Kingdom has steadily cut its emissions over the last 30 years and has managed to do so by reducing their coal usage, relying on clean energy, and instituting a carbon tax. The rest of the European Union has also published proposals to cut down vehicles' emissions by 30% for 2030. China has put in place a carbon market in an effort to halt their increasing emissions, in which companies have a cap on their carbon dioxide output and must pay to go over. If a company remains under the limit, they can sell the remaining allowances. This incentivizes environmental consciousness. The United States is also in the process of cutting emissions, but with the election of Donald Trump, the famous promoter of coal mining, the United States has taken a step back with regards to CO2 reduction, as Trump has left the Paris Climate Accords dedicated to dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. However, other countries have picked up the slack. Since 2000, 21 countries have disproved the notion that GDP growth must always be connected to raising CO2 emissions, as they have decoupled growing their economies while managing to reduce greenhouse gases. They have all done so in different ways, but the common theme is education. If the general public is informed about the harmful effects of carbon dioxide and the government is responsible enough to actively combat it, we can fight CO2 and achieve a cleaner future together.